The pen felt lighter than I expected when I signed my name on that last line. 41 years. That's how long I spent waking up before the sun, driving 40 minutes each way to the plant, eating lunch from the same blue thermos my wife Patricia packed for me every single morning until she passed. 41 years of overtime, of skipped vacations, of telling myself next summer until next summer became a word I stopped believing in. But that Tuesday in March, I walked out of First National Bank with a cashier's check for $87,000 money I had saved, quietly and carefully, in an account nobody knew about, and I drove straight to Hendricks Property Group on Route 9, and I bought myself a piece of land, 4 acres in Blue Ridge, Virginia. A slope of old oak trees, a creek that ran cold even in August, and a clearing just wide enough for the cabin I had already designed in my head 100 times over. The agent, a young woman named Sandra, kept asking me if I wanted to call someone first. A son, a daughter, anyone. No, I told her. This is mine. She smiled and stamped the deed. I was 63 years old, my knees hurt in the cold, and my hair had gone fully white 2 winters ago. But I had never felt more awake in my life than I did driving home that afternoon with that deed folded in my breast pocket, right against my chest. I should have kept it there. I should have kept it quiet a little longer, but I made the mistake that every father eventually makes. I told my daughter. Margaret came over for dinner that Friday, the way she did most Fridays, and I suppose I couldn't help myself. I was happy, real happy. The kind that bubbles up and spills over before you can catch it. I told her about the land, about the creek, about my plans to hire a small contractor out of Roanoke to put up a simple 2-bedroom cabin. Nothing fancy, just enough for one man to live well and wake up to birdsong. She looked at me across the pot roast, and she didn't say anything for a long moment. "Dad," she finally said, $87,000? It's my money, Margaret. Have you talked to Derek about this? I put my fork down. Derek, my son-in-law, a man I had known for 11 years and liked for approximately the first 4 of them. He sold insurance and spoke loudly about investments at family dinners and had, on 3 separate occasions, asked me what I planned to do with the house. When I got too old for the upkeep, he was 41 years old and already thinking about my house like it had his name on it somewhere in small print. "I don't need to talk to Derek about my land," I said. Margaret called him on the way home. I know because he showed up at my door the next morning at 9:30, before I'd even finished my coffee. He didn't knock so much as pound. 3 hard raps that rattled the glass panel. I opened the door and he was standing there in his weekend clothes, hands on his hips, with the particular expression of a man who has decided he is going to be reasonable with you whether you like it or not. "Frank," he said, "we need to talk about this Blue Ridge situation." "There's no situation," I said. "There's land. I bought it." He walked past me into the kitchen without being invited, poured himself a glass of water from my tap, set it down on my counter, and turned around like a man settling in for a long negotiation. "Margaret is worried," he said. "I'm worried. You're spending your retirement savings on a piece of mountain property. Do you have any idea what it costs to build a cabin? Permits alone in that county. I've done the research, Derek. You're 63. I'm aware. Frank." He leaned forward, put both palms flat on my kitchen table. "What happens when you can't maintain it? What happens when you're up there alone and something goes wrong? You haven't been the same since Patricia died. We've all noticed. Margaret cries about it. There it was. Patricia. He knew that name opened something in me that I couldn't always close back up fast enough. 3 years since I lost her and I still reached for her hand sometimes in the dark. But I recognized what he was doing. I'd watched him do it to other people. Wrap concern around an agenda until you couldn't tell which was which. "I think you should leave," I said. He straightened up, looked at me for a moment like I was a problem he was recalculating. "We'll talk more about this," he said. "The family is going to want to say." I locked the door behind him. I told myself it was finished. I was wrong. The calls started the following week. Margaret, twice a day, her voice pitched in that careful register she used when she was trying not to sound like she was reading from a script. My older son, Thomas, called from Phoenix on a Wednesday we hadn't spoken in 2 months, suddenly very concerned about my mental state and my decision-making capacity, 2 phrases that don't come naturally to a man who usually called to talk about football. Then my neighbor Judy told me she'd seen a car parked outside my house for 2 hours on a Thursday afternoon. Dark blue Buick. Just sitting there. I started paying attention in a different way after that. 6 weeks after I bought the land, I got a letter from an attorney's office in Richmond. The letterhead was clean and expensive looking. Inside was a notice that Margaret and Thomas, acting together, had filed a petition in court claiming that I showed signs of cognitive decline and requesting that a guardian be appointed to oversee my financial decisions. I sat at my kitchen table and read it 3 times. Then I put it in the drawer, made myself a cup of coffee, and called my own attorney. His name is Wallace Briggs. I've used him for 20 years, drew up Patricia's will, handled the refinancing on the house back in 2009. General man of all legal trades. He's in his late 60s himself, slow-talking and unhurried. And when I read him the letter over the phone, he didn't gasp or rush. He just said, "All right, Frank. When can you come in?" I went the next morning. Wallace explained it clearly. A guardianship petition required the court to appoint an independent evaluator who would assess my mental fitness. It wasn't automatic. It wasn't fast. And it was not, he told me with the measured calm of someone who had seen families do terrible things to each other, guaranteed to go their way. "What do we do?" I asked. "We get ahead of it," he said, "and we document everything. I want to be honest about something. There was a week in there, maybe 10 days, where I sat in my living room at night and felt something very close to broken. Not because I doubted myself. I knew my mind was sound. I could still do the crossword in under 20 minutes. Still remembered every detail of the land survey. Still knew my social security number and my blood pressure medication and the names of every man I'd worked alongside at the plant for 4 decades. What hurt was different. It was Margaret, sitting across that pot roast table, watching me the way she had, and then going home to make a plan against me. It was Thomas on the phone using clinical language he didn't come up with himself. It was the understanding that somewhere along the way my children had looked at what I'd built and decided it was already theirs to divide. Patricia would have known what to say. She always did. I made myself get up. I went to my Dr. Anand Kapoor, a careful and thorough man, and I told him what was happening and asked him to administer every cognitive assessment available. He gave me 4 of them over 2 appointments. I scored in the top 15% for my age group across all of them. He put it all in writing, signed, dated, filed with my records. I went to a financial advisor named Ruth Chen at Piedmont Wealth Management, and I had her review every transaction from my savings account for the past 7 years. Every dollar accounted for, every decision documented, every withdrawal logical. She wrote a 4-page summary and signed it. I went back to Wallace, and we drafted a comprehensive record of my mental and financial fitness medical evaluations, financial audit, character statements from my doctor, my pharmacist, 3 longtime friends, and Judy from next door who had known me for 22 years. And then I did one more thing. Wallace had suggested it almost as an afterthought, but it turned out to be the most important thing I did. I established an irrevocable living trust and transferred the Blue Ridge property and a significant portion of my remaining assets into it. The trust named me as the sole beneficiary during my lifetime, with Wallace as the successor trustee. It was structured so that no guardianship petition, no matter how it was filed or who filed it, could touch the principal assets inside it. They were protected, legally, completely, and permanently. We printed the trust documents and the complete documentation package. Wallace kept the originals in his safe. I kept a copy folded neatly, sealed in a plain envelope in the lockbox in my study, and I kept one more copy somewhere else, somewhere that would matter at exactly the right moment. The court date came on a gray morning in October. The courthouse in our county is an old brick building with high windows that let in very little light, and the waiting room smells like floor wax and old paper. I sat on a wooden bench in my good charcoal suit, the one I'd worn to Patricia's funeral and to my retirement dinner, and I watched the door. Derek came in first. He was wearing a tie I'd never seen before, dark red, the kind men wear when they want to appear trustworthy. He didn't look at me. Margaret came in behind him, and she did look at me just for a second, and I watched something move across her face that I couldn't quite name. Not guilt. Not quite. Something more like a door closing. Thomas had flown in from Phoenix. He sat on the other side of Derek and checked his phone. Their attorney was a young man named Patterson, who carried a very full briefcase and kept straightening his papers. Wallace sat beside me and said nothing. He didn't need to say anything. The evaluator the court had appointed was a woman named Dr. Susan Hartley, a clinical neuropsychologist with 20 years of experience in exactly these proceedings. She had met with me twice before this date, thorough interviews, additional testing, review of records. She had also, as required, reviewed the documentation package Wallace had submitted. Patterson presented their case first. He talked about the land purchase, the amount of money, my isolation since Patricia's death, my erratic behavior, which turned out to mean that I had stopped attending Sunday dinners at Margaret's house, which I had done because Derek made those dinners unpleasant, which is not erratic. That is called a reasonable response to an unpleasant situation. He called Thomas to speak. Thomas talked for 4 minutes about how I seemed different and distant and not himself. When the judge asked him to provide specific incidents, he mentioned that I had forgotten his birthday in June. I had not forgotten it. I had sent a card. He simply hadn't acknowledged it. Then Dr. Hartley spoke. She was precise, and she was thorough, and she went through the assessment results one by one. She referenced the scores, the percentiles, the comparative data for men in my age group. She described our interviews. She noted that I had answered every question fully, demonstrated clear recall, articulated my reasoning for the land purchase in organized and coherent terms, and showed no signs of cognitive impairment of any kind. She concluded that there was no clinical basis for the petition. The judge looked at Patterson. Patterson straightened his papers. The petition was dismissed. I thanked Wallace on the courthouse steps and drove home. I sat in my kitchen for a while. The afternoon light came through the window the way it did in October, long and low, and I thought about Patricia, and about the creek in Blue Ridge, and about 41 years of a blue thermos, and I felt, for the first time in months, that the weight of it had shifted. Margaret called that evening. I let it go to voicemail. I wasn't ready. Maybe in a few weeks I would be ready to have that conversation, the real one, not the legal one, the one about what she had actually done and why, and what it would take for us to find some ground on the other side of it. I didn't know yet if that conversation was possible. I only knew I wasn't going to have it on anyone's schedule but my own. Thomas didn't call. Derek sent an email 3 days later. It was 3 paragraphs about how everything had been done out of love and concern, and how he hoped there were no hard feelings. I read it once. I did not reply. Construction on the cabin started the 2nd week of November. The contractor's name was Dale, a compact and efficient man from Roanoke, who had been building in the Blue Ridge area for 30 years. He walked the clearing with me on the first morning, hands in his vest pockets, nodding at the oaks, and he said he thought we could be closed in by March if the winter was mild. I drove up every Saturday to watch it go up, the frame first, then the walls, then the roof taking shape against the mountain sky. I brought coffee in a thermos, not the blue one, a new green one I'd bought at the hardware store, and I sat on a camp chair Dale had lent me, and I watched men build something that was mine. There was a Saturday in January when the temperature dropped hard overnight, and I got there early, and the whole clearing was coated in frost. Every branch of every oak edged in white, and the half-built cabin sat in the middle of it looking like something out of a painting. I sat there for a long time with my coffee going cold in my hands, and I didn't feel lonely. I felt like a man who had arrived somewhere after a very long drive. I want to tell you about the envelope. After the court date, after the dismissal, after everything settled into a quieter kind of life, I went back to my study, and I took the envelope out of the place where I'd put it, and I held it for a minute. When Derek had first come to my house and made his speech about concern and family and my mental state, I had been angry. Of course I had, but I was also, and I don't know if this makes sense, not entirely surprised. I had watched that man for 11 years, and I had understood, slowly, and then all at once, what he was. So even then, even in those early days when I was still absorbing what was happening, I had started to think clearly. The envelope I had set aside wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a trap or a gotcha or a villain's undoing in a movie. It was simply a copy of the trust documents and the medical evaluations and the financial audit, prepared in advance, because I had decided early on that I was not going to let the story of my life be told by other people in a courtroom. I was going to tell it myself, with evidence, on my own terms. I had given a copy of that envelope to Wallace. I had filed one in my lockbox, and I had mailed one certified return receipt to my own address 3 weeks before the court date, so that the postmark would establish the date of preparation beyond any question. It sat unopened in my study, the seal intact, a date stamped on it that said everything I needed it to say. I don't know if Derek ever understood that. I don't know what he thought when the petition was dismissed. I don't know what he told Margaret that night, or what they said to each other in the weeks after. What I know is that the cabin was finished on the 14th of March, right on Dale's estimate. He called me at 7 in the morning, and I drove up that same day. 3 hours, with the windows down and the early spring air coming in cold and green. The cabin sat in the clearing exactly as I had imagined it. Not big, not impressive. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with south-facing windows, a porch wide enough for 2 chairs and a small table. The creek was running fast from the snowmelt, and I could hear it from the porch without even trying. I brought 1 bag. I had packed light on purpose. I put the coffee on and I went out and sat in one of the porch chairs, and I looked at the oaks, which were just beginning to think about spring, tiny tight buds at the tips of every branch. A hawk moved in a slow circle somewhere above the tree line. The creek talked to itself in the distance. I thought about the plant and the blue thermos, and the 40-minute drive each way, and all the next summers I had promised myself and never taken. I thought about Patricia, who would have loved this, who would have made the other chair hers within the first 10 minutes and started planning a garden along the south wall before the coffee was done. I talked to her sometimes, not out loud, just in my head, in the way you do when someone has been the organizing fact of your life for 38 years. I told her about the creek and the hawk, and the way the frost had looked in January. I believe she would have approved. I am not a man who spends much time on anger. It eats the hours, and it changes nothing. What Derek did, what Thomas did, what Margaret allowed to happen, I hold it, I understand it, and I have put it in the place where I keep things I have finished thinking about. There will be conversations eventually, or there won't. I am not going to spend whatever time I have left waiting for apologies that may never come. What I know is this. I worked 41 years for that land. I planned for it. I documented it. I protected it. And I stood in a courthouse in my good charcoal suit, and I let the evidence speak. And then I drove 3 hours with the windows down, and I made coffee on my own porch, and I listened to my creek. Nobody gave me that. I built it. Quietly, and on my own terms, and it is mine. The hawk came back the next morning. I watched it from the same chair with the same coffee, and I thought, good. I thought, this is exactly what I came here for.